What's up everybody, I'm Shuck. I'm a multi-rank 1 challenger mid laner. Syndra is one of my most played champions of all time in both competitive and in solo queue, and I've been known as the best Syndra in OCE for a few years now. Syndra is a champ that I see very often misplayed even by other pro players and challenger level mid laners, so hopefully in today's guide I'll be giving you everything you need in order to succeed with Syndra. Okay guys, let's start out by talking about runes on Syndra. So you have a lot of options when it comes to your keystones, and there's a lot of different situations you can take them in, but by far the most common and most useful rune page is this one right here with Phase Rush, Sorcery Primary, and Inspiration Secondary. Phase Rush is probably the best overall keystone on Syndra. It can be used to trade in lane, it scales really well, it counters a lot of the meta with a lot of like melee champions running around. So if you don't know what to take, or you just want a standard kind of like fit all situations rune page, then I definitely recommend this one here. When it comes to the secondary runes, these ones right here, there are a few you can change. I think if you can't get value out of Scorch in your lane, like if you don't think you can solo kill your opponent, I'd recommend taking Gathering Storm instead. I wouldn't really recommend changing Transcendence for absolute focus, but you could try it if you want. Mana Flow is basically mandatory, so make sure you keep that. When it comes to inspiration, you do have a few different options. If you verse a champion with skill shots such as Orianna, Xerath, anything like that, I'd really recommend taking Biscuits and Time Warp Tonic. This gives you so much extra movement speed in lane, and it's just really good in general. If you're not versus a champion with skill shots, I'd recommend taking Cosmic Insight and Magical Footwear instead. I think this is a far greedier rune page, but if the enemy mid doesn't really have skill shots that you need to dodge, I think you can get away with this most of the time. When it comes to the shards, you can go either attack speed or AP here. It depends a lot on the matchup. You kind of just got to get used to this. I think it's easier to use attack speed because it'll help you CS, but the way I kind of think about this is if I can spam harass my opponent, I will take the AP instead. And if I don't need the attack speed in order to kind of like maintain priority in matchup, then that's another reason I could take AP. But I think most of the time you should just take attack speed. It's like easier to use. It'll make your CSing a lot easier. Moving over to our second option for keystone, we have Arcane Comet. This is definitely the stronger keystone in lane. It gives you a lot of extra damage with your harass. One thing I would say is if you are taking Comet, you should almost certainly take Scorch because you're kind of all-inning on the laning phase. I think Comet is really good in matchups that you can't really easily 100-0 all in, but you're going to be poking them a lot. And you're not really scared of them chasing you down, like you don't need Phase Rush to disengage from a trade. So if you're in a matchup where you can really heavily harass your opponent, I think Comet is a better option than Phase Rush, but do like keep in mind that it doesn't scale as well as Phase Rush, and you are kind of all-inning on the laning phase, so you need to play the lane phase really well. Next up we have Electrocute. Electrocute I would pretty much only take if you're taking Ignite, and this is a keystone that you take when you're very, very confident that you can 100-0 the enemy mid laner, and you're not so much playing to poke, but rather you're just playing for the kill with your ultimate and Ignite. These runes pretty much aren't changeable, the secondary runes here, although you can change your secondary tree. Again, if you're versus a skill shot champion, I'd highly recommend taking Biscuits and Time Warp. If you're versus a champion that doesn't have skill shots, rather than going Boots and Cosmic, I'd highly recommend going Mana Flow and Transcendence instead. Because you're going Electrocute Primary, you won't have Mana Flow, and this can help solve some of your mana problems. Finally, we have the Predator rune page. This is very flavor of the month. I think it's probably the strongest rune page on Syndra at the moment, but I'm expecting it kind of gets nerfed into the ground by the end of preseason. But if you want to abuse it at the moment, that's a good idea. Just if you're watching this guide later on, if Predator's been nerfed, it's probably not as strong as the other ones anymore. If you are taking Predator, you want to make sure to pick up Ingenious Hunter. The reason why this rune is so strong at the moment is it allows you to kind of just walk down the bot lane and pick up free kills whenever you want. Syndra has a lot of CC and burst, so she's really good at picking up kills when she roams. When it comes to your secondary, once again, make sure you choose these two, the Biscuits and Time Warp if the enemy mid has skill shots. Otherwise, just go Sorcery, grab your Mana Flow and Transcendence. One thing is if you are taking Predator, the attack speed is actually really important because this is going to allow you to push the wave even quicker without using up all your mana. So I'd really recommend making sure you have this as well as Ingenious Hunter if you are going the Predator build. So in conclusion, for the runes, basically you want Phase Rush is kind of your all-purpose, can counter a lot of melee champions. You can just use it basically any game you want though. Comet, really good if you want to poke in lane. You're not necessarily looking for 100-0 all in, you're just looking to slowly poke them down. Very lane dominant build. Electrocute Ignite is really good if you're just looking to 100-0 your opponent, basically from full HP. You're really confident you can snowball, you can get a solo kill. And finally, Predator, flavor of the month, really strong at the moment, really good for roaming, especially if you think you can't kill your opponent in lane. So yeah, I think that's it for runes. Next, let's talk about the items on Syndra. So for your starting items, you have either Doran's Ring with 2 potions or the corrupting part. The way I'd normally decide this would be if you're in a matchup where you think you aren't going to take much harass, where you're going to be the one mainly harassing them, I would definitely start with Doran's Ring and 2 potions. This gives you the most mana and the most damage, so if you don't think you're going to be traded back on, you're mainly just going to be hitting them, I'd definitely recommend that. On the other hand, if you are taking Time Warp Tonic because they have skill shots, or you just think you're going to be taking damage in lane in general, I would go Corrupting Pot. If you're not sure, Corrupting Potion is definitely safer, but if you feel like you can get away with it, then go the Doran's Ring. When it comes to early buys, there are some items you should pick up pretty much every game. If you started Doran's Ring, I would highly recommend getting a refillable potion on your first base. If you started Corrupting Pot, obviously you don't need this. If you do have the gold, I would almost always recommend getting a Dark Seal. Syndra snowballs really well, and in solo queue there's like plenty of opportunities for you to pick up some stacks, and Dark Seal becomes really efficient. So make sure to grab one of those. Boots, if you don't have magical footwear, are pretty worth buying for only 300 gold. They help a lot in matchups, again, with skill shots. If you've got the Time Warp Tonic, Corrupting Pot, and Boots, you'll be able to dodge way more skill shots. Lost Chapter, if you do have the gold for it, is what you want to pick up, and obviously you want to work towards it. If you don't have the gold, this basically fixes all your mana problems and starts letting you really like snowball and take over the lane. So once you have the other items, or if you just have enough gold for this, then start working towards this. The next 2 early buys are a bit situational. If you're against an AD mid that's looking to all in you, champs like Zed or Talon, then Seekers can be a really good option, but it's not a good option against every AD mid. A lot of them will attack your mana pool instead of your HP, so champions like Lucian or Akshan will instead just like spam push you in, and if you go Seekers in these matchups, then you probably just won't have any mana to actually do anything. So definitely don't buy Seekers versus every AD champion, but buy it against AD assassins that are looking to kind of all in you from 100% HP. The next thing is Merc Treads. This also is situational. Against mids that have a lot of CC, so champs like LeBlanc, this can be a good option. But the main time I buy this is when both the enemy mid and jungle are AP, and they have some sort of CC. So champs like LeBlanc Elise, for example, that's a lot of AP damage, also a lot of CC. The Merc Treads can be really valuable. If you're against a mid jungle that doesn't have CC, but they are just both AP, so let's say you're versus like Orianna and Zac or something where the tenacity doesn't actually help you, I think in that case I'd probably just go the Null Magic Mantle rather than building the full Merc Treads. Moving on to your boot options themselves, you kind of have 3 that are really good. We've already talked about Merc Treads. Basically you just need it for when there's AP or heavy CC. Sork Shoes are definitely your default. Syndra gets a lot of value from Magic Pen. It really helps their 100-0 targets. So you can go that most games. The time to go Lucidity, there's a few reasons. So first, if the enemy team is building a lot of MR, Flat Pen won't be as useful. So for example, if your team is pretty heavy on AP, you'll probably get more damage out of the CDR from the Lucidity boots. Also, Lucidity boots can be pretty useful if you just need flash cooldown. So if, for example, the enemy team has, say, Jarvan, where you kind of need your flash up or you just can't survive, in that situation, the Lucidity boots can be a really good option. When it comes to your standard build, most likely you want to finish your Mythic, which is going to be Ludens in 90% of cases, and then finish up your tier 2 boots of choice. After that, your second item does have some choices, but Shadow Flame will be good most of the time. It gives a lot of flat pen against shielded targets, against low HP targets. So in solo queue, at the moment, there's a lot of squishy champs running around, so Syndra will be able to blow them up. After you complete your 3 core, your 2 items and your boots, after that you can kind of mix and match with what items you want. Void Staff and Rabadons are both really crucial to pick up, however. It just depends on which order you want them in. So if you need a Magic Pen, like if they're building tons of MR, you might want to buy a Void Staff first. But if they're not, Rabadons will normally give you more damage overall. So it just basically you want to pick up your Void and Rabadons after these first 3 items. But which order you pick them up in kind of depends on how the game's going. Lastly, and if you haven't bought any situational items before, you will probably want to round out your build with the Zhonya's. It's just the most versatile and it'll be useful in most games. When it comes to alternate mythics, Syndra actually does have some pretty good options. Liandry's is pretty good against tankier teams. Honestly, I wouldn't recommend playing Syndra against tankier teams, but if you do end up against them, then Liandry's is a good option. It gives you CDR so you can spam more. The dot helps you do more damage, obviously, to higher HP targets. With the preseason patch, Everfrost and Crown of the Shattered Queen have had massive changes. Obviously, Crown wasn't even in the game, and then Everfrost got its gold reduced by 400. So both of these are really good options now. I think Everfrost is very good if you're new to Syndra. It gives you a little bit of extra HP to play with, so you don't have to play quite as well in team fights. Also, it can help you land that QE in a lot of cases. You can just be in range to Everfrost someone, and then it kind of guarantees a QE on it. So I think Everfrost can be really good if you're new to Syndra, but most of the time Ludens will outperform it if you are good at Syndra. Crown of the Shattered Queen, on the other hand, if you are against assassins, if you are against champs that really want to dive on you, champs like Nocturne, Jarvan, Talon, Zed, basically any champ that's going to want to assassinate you but can't really reliably pop the shield before doing so, this is going to have really high value against. Examples of champs that kind of want to assassinate you that this isn't super value against is, say, champs like LeBlanc. Like LeBlanc can very easily proc the shield before she goes in for a one-shot a bit later. Or if you're just against like a lot of long range in general, the shield will constantly be on cooldown. So I wouldn't really recommend it against that, but yeah, if you're against assassins that want to dive on you, it's a very, very good item. Moving down to situational items, this can change a lot, basically depending on the game. If your Darksteel gets to about 8 to 10 stacked, I would almost always recommend buying a Medjai's unless you think you're going to die a lot. Medjai's is super gold efficient, it gives you a ton of move speed, it's really good in solo queue. The only caveat is obviously you do have to try not to die, but if you're fed, you shouldn't have any problems with that anyway. Next is Oblivion Orb. If they do have a lot of healing, you can buy an Oblivion Orb. I wouldn't recommend upgrading into a Morello. Normally you can get more damage from other areas that'll like kind of be better overall. So if you are going to buy healing card, I would only really recommend buying this. It's not really upgrading it. You lose a lot of damage for only 20% more healing essentially. Next we have Zhonya's and Banshees. So this can definitely replace your Shattered Flame as your second item if you need them. So like Zhonya's versus heavy AD teams versus champs like Zed, champs like Talon, Nocturne, anything that's going to dive on you, or if you just need the armor, it can be a really good second item to pick up instead of Shadow Flame, and then you can just proceed to your Rabadons and Void Staff like normal. Banshees is kind of in the same boat. If you're versus like a lot of AP combo champs, the MR can really cuck them, and also the shield can be very effective against champs like LeBlanc, champs like Ahri. Basically anything, if they just have like lots of AP threats, Banshees can be a really good second item instead of Shadow Flame. Finally, you have Cosmic Drive. Cosmic Drive is actually very good on Syndra at the moment. The changes are quite good for her. Even though Syndra is a burst mage, she normally gets a lot of cooldowns off in a fight, so the AP after hitting 3 spells on someone is quite effective on her. I would recommend picking this up over Shadow Flame if they are kind of tankier, if you're not really getting much of the flat magic pen. Honestly, you can just pick this up over Shadow Flame every time if you kind of want to play slower fights rather than just looking for bursting down one squishy targets. This is kind of up to you. Most of the time though, I think Shadow Flame will be better, but Cosmic Drive is a really good item at the moment too. When it comes to summoner spells, guys, you do have a few choices, but not that many. The most important, obviously, is that you take Flash every single game. Syndra is pretty immobile, and a lot of champions can punish her if her Flash is down, so you really need to make sure you are taking Flash. If you're playing Syndra without Flash, you'll probably die an extra 5 times every game, so that obviously should be your baseline. When it comes to your second sum, you have a few options. In solo queue, and especially if you're taking Electrocute, I'd say Ignite is the most useful. You're going to get to Snowball most of the time in solo queue, and Syndra in general has a very strong laning phase, and is quite good in early skirmishes, so Ignite's going to be really good for that. If you're in a matchup where you are going to take a lot of harass, or you're kind of on the back foot, or maybe you just want to play to impact other lanes, so for example if you're taking Predator or something, then Teleport is definitely better. This is definitely the second most common spell behind Ignite that you'll be taking. Teleport is pretty nice in Syndra because you can burn through all your mana and then just TP back and keep harassing them, but overall TP is a lot harder to use well, so if you're not super confident on it, I would probably just take Ignite instead. When it comes to defensive summoners, there are a few you can run. You can run Heal, Barrier, or Exhaust. I'd say this depends mainly on what champion you're against. Some champs, like some AD Assassins, are countered by Barrier, some are countered by Exhaust. So this is kind of matchup dependent. I do have a matchup guide on Mobifire, which I'll link in the description. So I'd recommend checking that out if you need specific summoners. But definitely Barrier, Exhaust most of the time if you're versus an Assassin that you're really scared of. Heal you can take. It's more for the mid jungle 2v2. It like helps your jungler. It gives move speed. I think most of the time I would prefer Ignite if I were playing for the mid jungle 2v2, but you could experiment with Heal if you still wanted to kind of play aggressively but you weren't super confident on Syndra yet. Finally, the last sum worth taking is Cleanse. I don't take this very often, but there are a few cases you want to take it in. If you're against champs with basically like point and click CC, champs like Lysandra, champs like Pantheon, Annie, or if they just have like a really strong mid-jungle ganking combo with a lot of CC, champs like Elise LeBlanc, for example, then Cleanse can get you a lot of value in those cases. So when it comes to Syndra's abilities, I'll quickly demonstrate how to use them and what they do. Starting off with Syndra's Q, it just places an orb that does damage just in an area. It's a circular skill shot, basically like any other. The orbs last for 6 seconds, and you can cast them every 4 seconds, I believe. Okay, yeah, 4 seconds by default, so you can end up with quite a few orbs on the ground. Next up, moving to the W. The W can be used to pick up minions, it can be used to pick up orbs, jungle camps, basically anything that's not a champion can be picked up, and you can then throw it back down on the ground. Next we have the E, which is a cone skill shot. It also pushes any orbs that are in the E and makes them stun targets they hit into, like this. Finally, we have Syndra's ult, which does a ton of damage and does more damage based on how many orbs are on the ground. So the more orbs that you have on the ground, the more damage the ult will do. Next, let's talk about some really basic combos on Syndra. Probably the most basic and most useful one is the QE combo. This is where you Q and E slightly after, which just allows you to stun a target pretty much at max range. You can follow this QE up by Wing the target like this and autoing, which will proc electrocute. Getting a bit more advanced, you can E off an orb that's already on the ground and then follow that up with another Q and a W to get a bit of a stronger trade. When it comes to all-inning in lane, there's a few things we need to understand first. As we said before, Syndra's ult does more damage with more orbs on the ground, but they time out after 6 seconds. One interesting thing about W is that if you pick up an orb and place it back down, it actually resets the timer. It doesn't just continue it on from when you picked it up, it fully resets the timer. This way, we can get more orbs on the ground and do more damage even early in the game when we don't have much CDR. By far the most common way to all-in at level 6 is by placing a couple orbs on the ground and then using that to get a bigger stun. So you can cast these in the minion wave and then look to stun off it, and it makes it harder to dodge. Use your W to pick up the orb that was timing out, and then QR, which will get you a ton of damage after resetting the first orb. If you have extra time or you need extra damage, you can wait to place another orb before you ult, but most of the time you won't need it. But it depends on their HP, so you kind of just have to experiment for yourself. Another way I get a lot of all-ins at level 6 is if you have an orb that's already on the ground, you can normally move around it and then look for a stun off it if they don't respond by moving as well. So what you can do with this is you can E, and then when your Q is back up, you can just drop another Q on them, pick up the original orb, and then ult them. So that gives you a ton of damage. Again, you can go a bit slower if you want to wait, so let's do it again. If we want to get extra damage, we can go like this. we can pick up the original orb, wait for our next Q, and then drop the QR on them. If you can make sure they don't get out of your range, this does do more damage, but most of the time they'll probably be getting out of range, so it kind of depends. Let's move on to some more advanced combos. So probably the most useful one is the delayed EQ stun. To do this, you just place a Q at the end of your E and you'll get a delayed stun like this. This can help catch people off guard, and it's also quite useful against champions that are going to dash into you, champs like Lucian, champs like Aurelia. So if you can master the EQ combo, it can be very useful. It kind of takes a little bit of practice to get used to where you need to put the Q, but ultimately it's not that hard to pull off, and it's definitely very useful. So one thing that's really useful is your W. One thing that people don't know is that because Syndra holds the W behind her on the animation, it's actually quicker to turn around and throw your W than it is to just throw your W regularly. So if you Q here and then W and turn around and then W behind you, it's significantly quicker than if you just pick up a W in front of you and then W towards them. So whenever you throw W, you want to make sure to turn around when you're throwing it. It'll make it a lot quicker. You can also combo this with stuns, so you can pick it up and then look for a stun behind you like that. It's very hard to dodge this. It's basically instant. So if you can master the habit of turning around whenever you pick up W, you'll be able to throw them a lot quicker. Another useful trick is that you can hide your Syndra stun in walls. So for example, if there's a person here, you can QE through the wall, and actually I think I can stun him here too. Yep. So you can stun people from pretty far, and it can be really useful to hide the stun in walls. Oops. And get really long stuns that way. Finally, when it comes to team fights, there are a few combos that are quite useful. Probably the most common one is if you just ult someone, you can then stun afterwards to get a pretty much lane-wide stun. Obviously, if you have more balls on the ground before you do this, it's very useful. You can place more balls on the ground and look to reset one with your W, and this can give you a bigger ult and also a bigger stun. Another way to start team fights is instead of ulting first, you can actually stun first. So if we just get some balls on the ground here, it can be really difficult for people to dodge this. You just stun them all, and then you can look for an ult on one of their targets that's stunned. Those are definitely the two most common combos in team fights. I would say another one that you can do is you can just fish for QEs. The problem is though, your stun has a very long cooldown, and if you miss this, it's unlikely you will get to stun again in the team fight, because at least in the higher lows, you will get punished for wasting your stun. So by far the easier ways to do it is, yeah, just lay down some balls before the fight and get a big stun that way, or ult the target first and then use that to get a big stun. So next, we'll talk about Syndra's lane phase. Syndra's lane phase can be played a couple different ways based on the type of matchup you're in. Also, if you have TP versus like Ignite or a different summoner. But the core concept of Syndra's lane phase is actually quite simple, but it is hard to execute. Essentially, you want to harass your opponent with your Q on basically every CS they go for. If you have TP, obviously this is a bit easier because if you run out of mana, you can just TP back. Whereas if you have Ignite, you're more playing for that level 6 all in. So let's start with an even matchup and how you should play that one. So this is a VOD from my stream where I played Syndra versus Zoe, which is basically a skill matchup, slightly Syndra favored. But the main thing we're going to try to do here is every time she goes for a CS, we're going to try to Q her. Syndra's lane strength is mainly a mechanics check, both from you and from the opponent, like how many Qs you can hit and how many Qs they can dodge. So in a lot of cases, your Syndra lane phase will just come down to like how good you are at hitting your Q and how good your opponent is at dodging skill shots. In this matchup, however, Zoe is like fairly predictable when she moves forward with her Q as well as when she goes to CS, so we can hit a lot of Qs when she comes up to CS, like this. Syndra's Q only has a 4-second cooldown and has a really low mana cost for how little it costs, so you can spam it basically on cooldown. I wouldn't recommend using it when they're not going for a CS unless you're really confident, and especially if you don't have TP, I wouldn't do that because you're going to waste a lot of mana that way if you're missing them. So yeah, just think about how you can hit as many Qs as possible. At level 2, you put a point in E, you can start fishing for QE or EQ trades and looking to weave in an auto attack with them, but you don't really have that much all-in threat at level 2. You can just keep poking with Q. Syndra's lane phase can kind of be divided into pre-6 and post-6. I think pre-6, yeah, like I said, the most important is just to harass, whereas post-6, you're looking for an all-in. But I'd quickly like to highlight here, one thing I do that I see basically no other Syndras do is I put 2 points in Q at level 3. The reason this is good is it increases the damage on Q while only increasing its mana by 10, so it becomes a much more efficient spell to cast. This allows you to harass way more. I would recommend putting a point in W at level 3 if you're planning to all-in, but otherwise the second point in Q is probably better. Now that we've talked how to use the abilities in lane, let's quickly go back so I can talk about the wave control. So when you're in an even matchup like this, or a slightly advantaged matchup, you want to push the lane so that you hit level 2 first, and so you have a slight creep advantage. Because you're only slightly advantaged or just an even matchup, you're probably not going to be able to build the waves significantly, but you just want a small creep advantage, which gives you an edge in trades, as well as to hit level 2 before your opponent. So you see, in the next few waves, I just managed to just have a slight minion advantage. I'm slowly pushing it towards her with my autos, as well as harassing her with her Q. And you'll see that I hit level 2 first, and I can use that as an opportunity to trade. So now that we've hit level 6, we have an opportunity to look for all-ins. We're still going to be looking to harass her with Q, but now we'll also be looking to stun off our orbs on the ground and looking for all-ins with it. So you can see here, I'm looking to harass her with Q still when she goes for CS, but we also now have mana that we can start fishing with QE way more, and if we get her down a bit lower, we can just look for an all-in. Once you get mana on Syndra, it's way easier to just press your Q on cooldown. You don't have to just wait for when they go for CS. You just have enough mana to where you can just spam it constantly. So here, Zoe's getting pretty low. I'm going to start putting balls on the ground so that I can fish for the stun into ulti. So you see here, I lay one Q on the ground, and then I place another to make it easier to stun, go for the stun, and I look for the all-in off that. Now, if you quickly notice here, I actually did do a slight mistake. I could have picked up this ball here, this one here, so that I got an extra ball on my ulti, so that would kill her. I knew I had enough damage here, but like I was saying in the combos before, you should use your W to reset the cooldown on the orb, and that will allow you to get way more level 6 all-ins. Next, we'll look at a matchup where we're hard winning instead of just even. In this matchup, Syndra kind of just destroys Kassadin basically all game long. You have a lot of pressure over him early, and the only reason he can really beat you is in the side lane if he scales. But most of the time, you won't let him get to that. In this sort of matchup, you actually want to slow push the wave in as much as possible. This way you can deny a ton of creeps. You have a load of time to harass them while the wave goes in, and it's just generally harder for him to farm than if you just spam shove the wave under tower. Now you'll see I've also taken Ignite in this matchup, which means I can't quite spam Q as much as I did before with TP, but because I have Ignite, I have a much stronger all-in at level 6, so I can just, in the early game, mainly play for harass with auto attacks instead. As you can see, even though the second wave is already here, the wave is still in the middle, which makes it basically impossible for him to farm it. So anytime he wants to come up for the CS, he has to take a Q and an auto attack. So generally, if you have a hard winning matchup, you always look to slow push like this instead of kind of the harder push like we were doing before. It's really beneficial if you can stack up 3 waves to crash like this, because it gives you a lot of time to harass them under tower, and also gives you a ton of time if you want to look to invade their jungle, or you want to look to just secure the crab. So you'll see when the wave crashes under tower here, I have a load of time where I can just like chuck auto attacks, chuck Qs at him, and there isn't too much he can do about it, and it makes it really difficult for him to farm. So yeah, when you get these easy matchups, you just look to slow push in. You can take Ignite, play for the level 6 all-in. Finally, let's talk about what you're meant to do in hard matchups. In hard matchups, champs like Yasuo, Aurelia, Zed, Fizz, champs like that, generally you want to keep the wave on your side of the lane as opposed to push. The reason this is better is because it makes them gankable, and normally these champs are the type that want to run you down, and it means you can farm safely. So here I have an example of a pro match I played a few months ago, playing Syndra versus Yasuo, which is a pretty hard 1v1 for Syndra. But every time you'll see this game, every time the camera pans mid, the wave is kind of on my side. I'm keeping it just like frozen outside my tower. And that makes Yasuo really scared of ganks, and it also makes it quite safe for me to farm. You can see I take a lot of damage here, so I'm immediately sort of behind. But you'll see eventually this game, it turns into like a 20 CS CS lead at 8 minutes and then eventually a much bigger lead later on. And that's mainly just through smart wave control. So when you're in these hard matchups like this, you just want to keep the wave slightly pushing to you. Ideally, you don't want to let them crash it because then the wave will bounce back to them. Another thing you do need to be a little careful of is you don't want to let them constantly push the wave in. You really want the wave to be frozen so that they can't just like roam for free. If they do roam, you want them to lose a lot of creeps as opposed to them just losing nothing. Here a bit later in the game, we pan mid again. As you can see, the wave is once again like frozen outside my tower, and Yasuo really needs help to unfreeze it. This is really good because I'm just getting to farm for free, and a lot of people are having to come mid to help Yasuo, even though he's in a hard winning matchup. So in this case, this is like really, really good. And now that the wave's pushing back out, Yasuo is already low, so it's easy for us to push it in. Panning mid, again, you can see the wave. It's always in this spot, as you can see. It's always in this spot that's like just out my tower, where it's quite difficult for Yasuo to actually farm the wave, and he's also under gank threat, and all this time, there's like no way Yasuo can trade on me. So yeah, in these hard matchups, you just always want to keep the wave like right outside your tower here, and you can just look for gank setup. Syndra has really strong gank setup, and you can use that to stay safe, even in matchups that are really bad for you. When you're team fighting a Syndra, there's basically 3 things you need to think about. You need to think about who's the priority target that you need to ult. You need to think about what the threats are to use, so like stuff like Nautilus engage, Leonas, assassins, anything like that, basically just threats to you or your team. And you also need to think about how you can create the most value with your stun. So in this match here, their main threat of engage is Nautilus, and their most threatening champion is Aphelios. So you'll see in this fight, we start moving forward, traditional front to back team fight, and you'll see here Nautilus ults and Aphelios ults, and immediately I pick up the ball, but I don't use it. What I'm looking to do here is if Nautilus looks to engage, I'm going to WE him. So right now I'm thinking about this Nautilus and Aphelios as the most threatening members, and I'm looking for the stuns. Nautilus doesn't go in, eventually Aphelios gets kicked in, and I ult him, and I just ult off of that. So pretty simple. I'm just showing you the things I'm thinking about. Here's another fight from the same game where you can see the exact same thing. This time I don't have ult, but I have a lot of CDR because I'm level 16 and I have items. So I place a lot of balls on the ground during the fight here, and I use them to stop the enemy team from engaging. So we've said before that Aphelios and Nautilus are the most threatening members to our team. So when my team's dealing with these ones up here, I'm looking for the stun on this backline here. So you can see I've dropped a few Qs on the ground during this team fight, and then when these guys start to move up, I look for the stun, and I managed to stop all 3 of these guys from doing damage here while we're kind of kiting out on the back. So let's have a look at this fight. Here we can see my Aphelios is being chased, and you can actually see here I've put my mouse here ready for the QE stun because I can see that Castellan's going to ult on this guy and Graves going to move into him. So I already know here I'm waiting to use my stun. I could just QE the Graves right now, but it wouldn't do anything. Cassian wouldn't take any damage, so I'm actually waiting for Cass to go in. And here you see I get the double stun, it does tons of damage. Unfortunately, the team fight looks a bit lost, so we start to walk away. We're playing for our E cooldown to come back up here, and here's another trick you can do. If you W one way and then Q the other, you can actually set up a multi-prong stun like this in order to hit 2 people. That can make it a bit easier to stun multiple targets that are split up, so I'd highly recommend using that. Finally, guys, I'll briefly talk about the matchup tier list. This is my opinion. I think in general, assassin matchups, especially with sustain, are very difficult for Syndra. They normally have ways to avoid your damage, and they can kind of like play in your range, which is quite annoying for Syndra. Most mage matchups, or kind of like, yeah, mid-range champions are going to be favored to you, or skill matchup in some cases. And then there are a lot of matchups that are very easy for Syndra. Syndra in general has very strong 1v1 as well as 2v2, but she is quite gankable, which is why a lot of these champions are kind of like higher on the list. If you want kind of specifics on this on the matchups, I have linked my Mobifier guide below. If you just go to the threats section, I talk about every matchup in detail. Pretty much every matchup in the game as Syndra is winnable 1 versus 1. It's just some of them are much more difficult and others much more volatile. So yeah, I recommend going to check that out if you want specifics in terms of like what runes to take, what sums to take, stuff like that. So that's it for this one, boys. If you had any other questions, please leave a comment below. I will try to get to all of them. If there's another champion you'd like to see, let me know. I definitely want to do a few more of these. And yeah, if you liked it, make sure to like and subscribe. Appreciate it. See you next time.